My pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Jennifer Roback Morse earned a doctorate in economics from the University of Rochester and spent 15 years teaching at Yale University and George Mason University. She has served as research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. Her scholarly articles have appeared in numerous journals, including the Journal of Political Economy, Economic Inquiry, the Journal of Economic History, the University of Chicago Law Review, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and the Notre Dame Journal of Law, Ethics, and Public Policy. Public policy articles have also appeared in Forbes, Policy Review, the American Enterprise, Fortune, Reason, and the Wall Street Journal. She is also a regular contributor to National Review Online and the National Catholic Register. In 1991, she and her husband adopted a 2-year-old Romanian boy and gave birth to a baby girl. She left her full-time university teaching post in 1996 to move with her family to California. From March 2003 to August 2006, Dr. Morse and her husband were foster parents for San Diego County. During that time, they cared for a total of 8 foster children. Dr. Morse is founder and president of the Ruth Institute, a project of the National Organization for Marriage dedicated to promoting a lifelong married love between one man and one woman and creating an intellectual and social climate favorable to marriage. She is the author of 2 books, Smart Sex, Finding Lifelong Love in a Hookup World, and Love and Economics, originally subtitled Why the Laissez-Faire Family Doesn't Work, and in a recent reissue, the subtitle is It Takes a Family to Raise a Village, which probably might ring true to some of you anyway. Dr. Morse will speak to us today on the topic Sexual Liberation and the Urban Poor. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse to Gordon College.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to Gordon College. I'm looking forward to this opportunity to addressing this topic of sexual liberation in the urban poor. I'm going to turn this off, and hopefully that's a little less echo. Is that okay for the tech people back there? All right. Sounds a little good. I got a thumbs up from back there. Before I begin, I want to just make a little bit of an announcement about the Ruth Institute. As was mentioned, the Ruth Institute promotes lifelong married love to college students. And so we have a variety of programs that are of interest to college students. One of them is that we have a weekly electronic newsletter which has information about the whole range of marriage and life issues. We consider the whole range of issues that are germane to this topic. So not just the things I'm going to talk to you about tonight, but things that include the abortion issues and marriage and divorce and cohabitation and premarital sex and on and on and on, all those issues that are relevant. We have something to say about them. So if you read the Ruth Institute newsletter for a year's time, you will be very well informed about that whole area. So Professor Howard, did you start the thing going around? Can you hold it up, just so whoever has it, would you just hold it up so people can see that it's coming around on a clipboard, okay? So you're welcome to sign up on that. Your electronic address is the most important thing, okay? And then I want to just mention to all of you that the Ruth Institute is sponsoring a video contest. And we have a little card up here for the video contest. It's called the Real Love Challenge, real spelled R-E-E-L. The Real Love Challenge is how is lifelong love possible? And if you go to the ruthinstitute.org website, you'll see a whole sub-website about the video challenge. And what we're looking for is for young adults ages 18 to 24 to make videos about love, about lifelong married love, trying to get young people thinking about marriage, thinking about what's involved in getting married and staying married. And we want to see your representation of that in film, and you can upload your video to our site, and then there'll be prizes awarded for the best ones. And the way you win the prize is you have all your friends go and like your video. You know how you like things on Facebook and stuff? So you just make all your friends go like, and then you win the prize. That's the way it works. So we have cards with a little bit of information up here. If anybody's interested in it, we would certainly welcome your video submissions from students at Gordon College. That would be great to have you all participate. And then also, since our mission is to college students, we have other literature and stuff up there, but also there are certain things that, you know, one thinks are particularly necessary if one's trying to do a mission to college students. And so naturally, we have the Ruth Institute Frisbee, okay, with the Ruth Institute logo on it and everything. So I'll just pass that out to, naturally, the oldest person in the audience catches it, so that's great. What the heck? Just to show that everybody's welcome at the Ruth Institute and with our events. Actually, we got the idea to do that. The very first conference, we put on a summer conference in San Diego. That's where the Ruth Institute is based, is San Diego. We put on a summer conference out there, and it was a long weekend conference, and unbeknownst to us, some of the kids had organized a midnight Frisbee contest. So that was all going on while we were trying to, you know, the professors are all trying to sleep or whatever, and the students are out throwing Frisbee. So in honor of that kid, we made up a Ruth Institute Frisbee. So my topic for tonight, the theme for tonight, is sexual liberation and the urban poor. And in this lecture, I'm going to do three things for you. First, I'm going to talk about sexual liberation and define just what do we mean by that term. It's kind of an old-fashioned term in a way, but I think we can give some meaning to it. Second, I want to show that whatever benefits sexual liberation may have held for the middle-class men and women who promoted it, sexual liberation, in fact, has been disastrous to the poor. And then finally, I want to take up the vexing and difficult question of moralizing, or so-called imposing moral values or middle-class values on the poor. What I want to show is that the claim of moral neutrality, which is so often made in defense of the sexual revolution, is in fact a facade. That the claim of moral neutrality is a cover for arguments and ideas that really couldn't bear direct scrutiny or rigorous challenge. In point of fact, the government has been imposing a morality on the poor and, in fact, on everyone else. So, our first topic, what is sexual liberation? Well, this is a term that can take on many different meanings and encompass a variety of different issues. For our purposes here, I want to define sexual liberation to mean the separation of childbearing and sexual activity from marriage. Now, marriage has traditionally been the preferred context for sexual activity and for childbearing, not only in our society, but in fact, in every known society. Despite the wide variety of sexual norms that one can see in societies over time and around the world, all societies have some arrangement of adult rights and responsibilities that are preferred to others. And in fact, we could say are privileged, that some adult relationships, some adult situations are privileged over others. In fact, you could say that privileging some forms of sexual activity and some contexts for childbearing is the whole point of marriage, right? The point of the social institution of marriage is to say, this is the proper place for you to bear children. This is the proper place for sexual activity. Now, what is now called the sexual revolution or sexual liberation was trying to break down the privileged position for marriage. That's what it has always been about. We wanted to liberate ourselves from the constraints that marriage imposed. It was all very heady in the early days of the sexual revolution. We thought it would be fun to have sex without marriage. We thought it would be great to be independent of men and to have children without need of marriage. And of course, probably the most basic driver of the whole thing is that we thought it would be fun to have sex without children. By now, we've come full circle and people are having children without having sex, which I'm pretty sure is not as much fun as the old way. But I digress. We have Miss Octomom out in California, you know, with her litter of 8 babies that she had without ever getting near a man. You know, it's kind of strange. But anyway, but this language of liberation and constraints is not the only way to look at marriage. It's not the most important way to look at marriage. Instead, I want to conceptualize marriage as integrating 3 things. Marriage integrates our sexual activity, our child-rearing, and our love for our spouses. My love for my spouse means that my sexual activity is directed exclusively to him. Our sexual activity may result in children, whom we both love. Our sexual activity also builds up our love for each other and helps to sustain us over the lifetime of effort that's necessary to raise our children together. So let's call this view of marriage the organic and integrated view of marriage, as opposed to a modernist or liberationist view of marriage. Now, natural organic marriage is particularly important for the welfare of children. Unlike adults, children don't need autonomy or independence. The child is entitled to a relationship with and care from both of the people who brought him into being. Therefore, the child has a legitimate interest in the stability of his parents' union. But no child can defend these entitlements by himself, nor is it adequate to make restitution after the fact, after his rights have been violated. No child can march into court and say, see here now, my rights to my relationship with my parents have been violated. Someone get over here and do something about it. Of course, by the time the child's capable of doing that, he's already so old that he's missed out on being a 3-year-old. You know, you only get 1 year to be 3 years old. And so the child's right to relationship and care has to be supported proactively before harm is done for the rights to have any meaning or be protected at all. It's marriage that is adult society's institutional structure for protecting these legitimate interests of children. Let me say that again. Marriage is adult society's institutional structure for protecting the legitimate interests of children. Natural marriage attaches mothers and especially fathers to their children, and mothers and fathers to one another. Marriage also protects the interests of both parents in the rearing of their children, which is, after all, a common project that they share. Now, this explains the most basic features of marriage that were traditionally held to be true, namely permanence and sexual exclusivity. Those are the most basic, even defining features of marriage traditionally. So for the good of children, for the good of society, for the mutual good of the spouses, the institution of marriage makes demands for fidelity, demands for permanence, which are sometimes inconvenient, as we all would have to admit. But it's for the good it's for a higher good that we make these inconvenient demands on ourselves. Now, by contrast, modern family law today increasingly views marriage from the perspective of adult desires for autonomy and independent decision-making. Not surprisingly, making autonomy the highest priority, of course, disintegrates this marriage bundle. I've been told by law students and faculty alike that it's no longer necessary to link marriage and child rearing. It's not deemed necessary for the biological parent to be the legal parent or the caregiving parent or the social parent. The state, they say, has no particular interest in channeling parenthood into marriage or in assigning social and legal parental rights necessarily to the biological parent. In fact, under California law, children may have 5 parents: the sperm donor, the egg donor, the gestational mother who carries the baby to term, and the legal mother and father. In some states, courts have assigned custody rights to more than 2 individuals, for example, both members of a lesbian couple and the child's biological father. Now, I believe it's possible to show that each and every feature of the so-called sexual revolution has this property of breaking apart the different pieces of the organic reality of natural marriage. And each of these steps of breaking apart organic marriage has had the dual consequence of expanding the reach of the state and making us miserable. Now, since it's not possible to show each and every one of these cases in a single lecture tonight, I'll just illustrate this point with one of the most destructive steps, I believe, in the destruction and the deconstruction of marriage. And I'm referring to the widespread practice of cohabitation, that is, living in a sexual relationship without marriage. Now, cohabitation has been extensively studied by a variety of social science disciplines. As you heard, my background is in economics, and there's a lot of work that's been done in sociology and psychology on these subjects. The conclusion of all these studies is that cohabitation is not a good long-run alternative to marriage, nor is it a good preparation for marriage. Cohabiting relationships are less stable than marriage, and this instability creates a whole series of problems. The demographers have actually come up with a new name to describe the situation. They call it multiple partner fertility. In other words, they're no longer talking about out-of-wedlock childbearing, they're talking about multiple partner fertility. So now, rather than regale you with a whole series of statistics, let me just tell you a story of a hypothetical young lady that I'll call Lucy. Now, I realize that not each and everything that I'm about to describe is going to happen to each and every unmarried mother. The story I'm about to tell is a composite of things that are systematically more likely to happen to unmarried cohabiting women than to married women. Telling Lucy's story illustrates what the alternatives to marriage look like in the lives of ordinary people of modest means. Lucy has graduated from high school, and she has a job as a dental assistant. She lives with her boyfriend, Izzy. Lucy becomes pregnant. It isn't entirely clear whether this is an accidental pregnancy or not. She's been on the pill, but she has missed one or two. The failure rate for the pill for low-income cohabiting women under 20 is 48%. Lucy's glad to be pregnant. She's always wanted to be a mother. Izzy is not so happy. He's not ready to be a father, and pregnancy was not part of the deal. He feels cheated. Truthfully, Lucy isn't completely clear in her own mind whether she missed her pills on purpose or whether she really and truly forgot. They quarrel frequently. He sometimes hits her. Domestic violence is more common in cohabiting couples than in married couples. As her pregnancy proceeds, she becomes less and less interested in sex, and Izzy becomes less and less interested in her. He has sex with a former girlfriend. Cohabiting couples are more likely to have secondary sex partners. He feels entitled since he isn't getting any from Lucy, and after all, she cheated him by becoming pregnant in the first place. They quarrel some more, and he moves out for a while. But he starts to feel something for his baby, and he gives up the girlfriend. By the time baby Anna is born, Izzy has moved back in with Lucy. But now Lucy isn't so happy. In fact, she becomes depressed. The presence of children increases a cohabiting woman's probability of depression. Children do not affect a married woman's probability of becoming depressed after she has children. Izzy is caught up in the excitement for a while, but the combination of sleep deprivation, a needy infant, and a preoccupied and depressed Lucy are more than Izzy can handle. So he moves out for good when Anna is 6 months old. Cohabiting relationships are less stable than married relationships. He never offers to contribute support to the care of Anna. Never married fathers are much less likely to pay child support than fathers who were once married to the child's mother. Lucy finds she can't handle the demands of her job and take care of the baby by herself. She goes to court to try to get Izzy to pay child support. The court orders him to pay an amount that's nowhere near enough for Anna's needs, but he doesn't have a very good job, and so she seldom collects even that small amount that the court has ordered. Cohabiting men earn half the income of married men. So Lucy moves back in with her mother. Her mom, Eva, has a job as the office manager of a construction company. Lucy and her mom work out a schedule so that one of them is home with the baby most of the time. Everything goes along smoothly until Lucy becomes lonely. She becomes involved with Tom, a guy who seems pretty nice. He has a pretty good job, and he thinks the baby is cute. Lucy leaves her mom and moves in with Tom. Lucy becomes pregnant again. Tom becomes less and less tolerant of Anna, who is a toddler by this time. As Anna gets older, she looks more and more like Izzy, whom Lucy would prefer to forget and Tom would prefer never to know. Tom's happy when the new baby is a boy. They name him John. Of course, the new baby takes a lot of time. Anna feels neglected. She cries a lot, and she misbehaves. Lucy's exhausted. Tom helps her with the new baby, but he's not interested in Anna. Both parents begin to show a preference for little John. Men spend less time with their partner's children than with their own biological children. The presence of a stepfather decreases the time a mother spends with her own children. Anna's behavior deteriorates. Eva, the grandmother of Lucy's children, is quite concerned about little Anna. Eva had worried about her when Lucy moved back in with Tom. Now she sees her worst fears coming to pass. The adults, Eva, Lucy, and Tom, come up with the idea that maybe Anna would be better off moving back with Eva. Of course, when the family gets together for holidays at Eva's house, that is Grandma's house, Lucy and Tom come with little John. These reunions are painful reminders to Anna that her mother doesn't want her. She acts up each and every time she encounters her mother. One night, Tom and Lucy quarrel. Lucy takes baby John and goes back to her mother. Tom is furious. He wants her back and he wants his son back. Lucy refuses. They go to court. She gets a court order for child support. Tom gets a court order for visitation rights. He's trying to be a good father. His visits with his son are anguished. The little boy doesn't understand what is happening. He wants to go home with his daddy. Parental divorce increases a boy's probability of depression, regardless of the quality of parenting. Nothing seems to compensate for the sense of sadness the boys feel at the loss of their fathers from the home. Meanwhile, Lucy finds a new boyfriend, Joe. She takes Anna back from her mother, and she, Anna, and Johnny move in with him. And you guessed it, she gets pregnant again. The new boyfriend doesn't like little John, the reminder of Lucy's past relationship with Tom. One day while Lucy's at work, Joe slaps John. Children are more likely to be abused by their mother's boyfriend than anyone else. According to one study, children living in a household with an unrelated adult were 50 times more likely to die of inflicted injuries than children living with two biological parents. But he says Johnny isn't really hurt, and after all, he had it coming. Joe promises not to hit him again. Lucy wants to believe him. When Tom comes to visit his son, he notices that Johnny's been hurt. He confronts Joe. They get into a shoving match. Lucy calls the police, and Tom gets arrested. She gets a restraining order against Tom. While Tom's in jail, his parents try to get custody of little Johnny. They don't think much of Lucy and her new boyfriend. They hope that if they can get their grandson away from Lucy, then at least he'll be safe until Tom can get out of jail and get custody himself. Lucy loves Johnny, but the idea of relieving the tension between Joe and Johnny actually appeals to her. She hates the idea of losing her son to Tom's parents, whom she doesn't like very much. I mean, she has to admit they're nice to Johnny, but still, they're interfering busybodies. Joe talks her into letting Johnny stay with the grandparents on weekends. At the same time, Anna's behavior is deteriorating. She wets the bed just about every night. Children in cohabiting step-parent households are more likely to feel sad and lonely and to have poorer self-control. But this time she's in first grade. Lucy gets a call from the principal, Mr. Knowles. He's concerned about Anna. She tries to crawl into his lap every time she sees him. Mr. Knowles thinks that Anna needs a father figure and would benefit from counseling. Fatherless girls become sexually active earlier than girls with their fathers. They also get their periods earlier. Lucy gets angry and says there's nothing wrong with her daughter. Her boyfriend Joe is a perfectly fine father figure. But in her heart, she knows that not all is well with Anna. Joe makes fun of her bedwetting and complains about the smell. Lucy can't really stand up to him. She loves him. She doesn't want to lose him. And besides, she needs the income. I could go on, but you get the idea. Little Anna is on course for abusing drugs and alcohol, for teen pregnancy, and for a lifetime of multi-partner fertility herself. Johnny is at higher risk for violence, delinquency, and drug use. If Lucy had married one of these men and stuck with them, the life chances of herself and her children would have been greatly enhanced. Lucy and her husband could take care of their parents in their old age as well. Instead, Lucy and her children drain resources from her mother. Without marriage, the fathers of Lucy's children are unlikely to contribute much to the care of either the younger or the older generations. Having children within marriage allows the mother and the father to view the children as something that unites them rather than divides them. Now, you may object that some of these problems are associated with teen pregnancy and poverty, and of course that's partly true. But the deeper truth is that channeling sexual behavior and child-rearing into marriage creates wealth rather than dissipates it. Men behave differently when they marry, especially when they become married fathers. They earn more, work harder, and generally behave better. But that's not the only reason that marriage creates wealth. We can think of marriage as a mechanism for social cooperation. In this way, marriage resembles the economic market, which enhances the cooperation of millions of people. Those of you who are econ majors have probably heard of the work of Friedrich Hayek that shows how the price system coordinates and enhances cooperation of people who are complete strangers to one another. So we could say that marriage is the most basic unit of social cooperation, much more simple, more basic than something big and vast like the economic marketplace. A man and a woman come together for the long-term project of raising their children together. Their collaboration benefits their children, the wider society, and each of them individually. When parental cooperation breaks down, the society has to step in to pick up the slack. In modern times, the society that most often comes in to pick up the slack, of course, is the state. the government. And the government alternatives to parental cooperation simply don't do the job with anything like the same effectiveness or efficiency as the parents themselves. Now, you may object that Lucy's case of switching around from partner to partner is extreme and not typical. But once we jettison permanence and exclusivity as serious social norms, we're on very weak ground trying to say that she shouldn't ditch her partners so casually. If a husband is an unnecessary accessory to childbearing, why isn't it okay to have multiple children, each with a different father? Now, some may object that women of higher income and education will not face as many and as serious problems as someone like Lucy. Maybe you think that you or someone from your social class could cohabit, raise children, and do just fine. And in some cases, that might prove to be correct. After all, higher education and income and higher status people are better situated to face all kinds of life challenges. But the point is that every problem of the poor is exacerbated by the failure and destruction of marriage. The educated classes can participate in social practices such as cohabitation that become much more destructive as they trickle down into lower income classes to people of more modest means. It is no part of social justice to claim for yourself the rights to behaviors that you can manage, but which are in fact a disaster for the less fortunate. This practice of multiple partner fertility is by no means a minor problem. Once a woman has the first child out of wedlock, her chances of multiple partner fertility increase greatly. In fact, of all unmarried mothers with more than one child, almost 70% exhibit multiple partner fertility. We sometimes hear people ask about the root causes of poverty. This is an old term that you used to hear in the 70s all the time. This concern about the root causes of poverty strikes me as a little bit misplaced or perhaps overdone. It's almost as if we were required to find the one and only cause of poverty. Or we shouldn't bother addressing causes of poverty unless they're really somehow the ultimate cause. But this is really a kind of extremist style of thinking. We may very well be able to make progress in improving the life chances of the poor by addressing causal factors that aren't the ultimate cause of poverty. Some progress on many fronts could add up potentially to some significant benefits from people. It's not necessary in a certain way to wait until we've discovered the ultimate and final cause of poverty before we do anything, or that we do nothing until we deal with that ultimate cause. We also sometimes hear complaints about blaming the victim when the behavior of the poor themselves is taken to be a significant causal factor. This concern, too, strikes me as somewhat misplaced. It's simply not true that any responsibility by one party absolves all other parties of any responsibility whatsoever. Was that a little bit contorted of a sentence, or did you get the idea? The fact that I have no fault the fact that you have some fault doesn't absolve me, right? So there can be multiple people who have contributed to a problem here. So it may very well be that there are structural, economic, and policy factors that should be addressed to alleviate poverty, but that doesn't prove that the behavior of the poor themselves is somehow irrelevant to the problem. Most importantly, there's the very distinct possibility that the worst features of these policies may very well be that they induce bad behavior on the part of the poor. That is, the policies may create incentives for destructive behavior on the part of the poor, and that may be precisely what's wrong with the misguided policies. So blaming the victim is really changing the subject, you might say. We sometimes also hear that the problems of the poor are due to racism. But please notice the story I told had nothing to do with race. Lucy and Eva, Izzy, Tom, and Joe, they could have been black, brown, or white. There was nothing specifically racial about any part of the story that I told. And in fact, some of the people that I know that I modeled this story on, most of them are white, as a matter of fact. But it is true, we can say, that out-of-wedlock childbearing and all the associated problems are more common among lower-income ethnic groups. For example, the black community's 72% rate eclipses that of most other groups. That is, 72% of children born in the African American community are to unmarried mothers. Only 17% of Asians are born to unmarried mothers, 29% of whites, 53% of Hispanics, and 66% of Native Americans are born to unwedded mothers in 2008. The rate overall for the overall U.S. population is about 41% now in 2008, the most recent year for which government figures are available. So it hardly seems fair to regard family instability as some kind of legacy of slavery or the results of racism or something. Hispanics, of course, have no history of slavery, and the rate of unmarried childbearing among American blacks used to be a lot lower than it is today. In 1965, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote his famous report on the decline of the black family, he was alarmed over 25% of black children being born to unmarried mothers. Plainly, something else is going on here besides racism or the legacy of slavery. It would be very odd if the legacy of slavery were more intense today, to give you a 72% of out-of-wedlock childbearing rate, than it was in 1965, before the Civil Rights Movement, when you had a 25% rate of out-of-wedlock childbearing. So there's obviously something else going on. Whatever may be the case about racism or the legacy of slavery, there's obviously more to the story than that. There has to be. So rather than argue over the root causes of poverty, I think we ought to be asking, what are the policy-relevant causes of poverty? What are the policy-relevant causes of poverty? That is, what are things that would increase the likelihood of poverty that we could reasonably expect to change? Plainly, we can't change history. History is what it is. So the question is, what are the policy-relevant factors that we could reasonably expect to change that would be helpful in this area? It seems to me that would be the most constructive way to approach this problem. Now, once we ask the question in this form, it becomes clear that we can help the poor by adopting policies that create incentives to marry, and adopting policies that create incentives to having children inside of marriage rather than outside of marriage. We can adopt policies that create incentives to confine sexual activity to marriage and to reduce multiple partner fertility. Now, if you're not convinced that that's the case, just ask yourself these questions. Where do you think the African American community would be today if we had had the benefits of the Civil Rights Movement but had not had a sexual revolution? That is, what if we had had the Civil Rights Movement and still had a 25% out-of-wedlock childbearing rate among African Americans? I once asked this to a black pastor, and he just looked at me and got very sad, got a very sad look on his face, because of course he knew that the community would be far better off if we had had only the Civil Rights Movement and no sexual revolution. Or turn the question around. Let's start from where we are today. Forget about looking backwards. Let's say for some reason, improving the marriage culture of the poor is off the table as a policy option. Let's say we're not even going to consider that, but for some reason we think that's not possible, we're not even going to talk about it. Is it reasonable to believe that the poor, including African Americans, Hispanics, and poor whites, is it reasonable to believe that there's going to be any significant progress made without improving the marriage culture? If you put that off the table, is there any reasonable prospect to think that things are going to get significantly better? And I think that if we leave the health of the family in the kind of chaotic condition that it is in today, the odds are very much against making substantial improvements in the quality of life of the poor. So then we have to ask ourselves, is promoting marriage somehow an improper promoting of morality, of a particular form of morality? And remember, this is the third part of the talk, the third thing that I said that I would do. I said that I would tell you what sexual liberation is and what the consequences of sexual liberation has been for lower income classes. And then finally, we'll take up the question of whether it's appropriate or possible to somehow do something that's moral, that has a moral component to it as public policy. The considerations that I've offered so far strongly suggest that strengthening the marriage culture for lower income communities ought to be a very high priority in our poverty fighting efforts. We sometimes hear that it's not fair or just to impose middle class morality on lower classes. The government, it is said, must remain neutral regarding sexual behavior, marriage, and childbearing decisions. Now, the problem with this argument is that the government is already imposing a morality of its own. The federal government itself actively attacks the integrity of the family and the independence of local communities. To take just a single example, let me talk to you a bit about Medicare. Medicare is the largest provider of public family planning funding. Medicare provided over 70% of public expenditures in 2006, amounting to $1.3 billion spent on contraception, contraceptive education, sterilization, and abortion. The Medicaid rules that promote contraception have embedded within them empirical claims and moral arguments. And for the purposes of my discussion here, I don't care whether you agree with these particular moral claims that Medicare is implicitly making, or whether you agree with the opposite claims that I'll be implicitly making, but not saying. I don't care. I'm not here to persuade you about the particular morality. All I want to establish tonight is that, in fact, there's a moral code embedded in the Medicaid rules. So let me just spell out a couple of things about this. There may be some people here who are nurses or process insurance claims who know all of this, but I think the average person has no idea what's in the background of Medicare. Number one, birth control is a mandatory part of state Medicaid programs. Any state that does not want to offer family planning services will face a penalty and lose other Medicaid funds. For most other services, including life-saving services such as chemotherapy, the states have a choice about whether they offer them or not. Now, this combination of policies conveys the unmistakable message that preventing births is a higher priority than preserving the lives of sick people who need chemotherapy. Second, contraception is the most favored service in Medicaid in the following way. The federal government will pay 90% of a state's birth control-related expenses, a treatment accorded to no other category of mandatory services, nor to any other preventive medicines. Most services are reimbursed at 50%. So that includes, again, other forms of preventive health care and life-saving treatments. The federal government reimburses at 50% rather than the 90% for family planning practices. Of course, this is not a morally neutral posture that the federal government is adopting here. Third, birth control must be available to minors over the age of puberty. The states cannot adopt their own policies about how and whether to promote teen sexual activity. This policy has embedded within it the highly dubious empirical claim that making artificial birth control available promotes health and prevents teen pregnancy, and that it prevents teen pregnancy more effectively than other policies that you might adopt that seem to be less favorable by the government. We could think of quite a few policies right off the top of our heads without really breaking a sweat, as they used to say. We could think about the government promoting abstinence until marriage. We could think about the government teaching the natural rhythms of the body so that you know when your fertile period is. We could even think of the government providing teams with non-sexual activities to fill up their time so they don't not sitting home alone with in a latchkey apartment type of situation. You can think of any of those policies as possible things that would prevent teen pregnancy, but none of those are subsidized. None of those are promoted. It is only actively promoting birth control to minors as a policy to prevent teen pregnancy that is favored by the government in this way. Fourth, parents are prohibited from knowing whether their children receive birth control. Medicaid extends to children the same right to doctor-patient confidentiality that adults have. States cannot protect parents' rights to be informed of or involved with the health care decisions of their children. The federal government requires, in effect, that states undermine parental supervision and authority over their children. I think you will agree this is not a morally neutral stance. You may agree that it's good public policy. I'm not here to argue that. But the point is, it's not a morally neutral position. The government has an implicit morality here in the way that it's treating these type of medical decisions and the privacy around them. Contraception must be free to people on welfare. The state cannot even require a nominal fee or a copay. The tacit moral message here is that the problems associated with non-marital sexual activity can all be contracepted away. Hence, we give away contraception. And state governments must actively promote family planning services, especially to minors. The state Medicaid costs associated with outreach, advertising and sexual education are reimbursed to the states at the same favorable 90% rate. So you have the specter of states trying to repackage things as family planning education services so that they can be reimbursed at 90% rate. So once again, we have the state with an implicit statement of what they believe is the morally correct thing to be doing. This is not a morally neutral policy. Again, whether you think it's a good policy or not, I'm not here to argue that particular point. It's just that there is a morality embedded within these policies. Plainly, the government is already promoting a particular view of morality. It's a view which says that sex can be treated as if it were a sterile recreational activity. A view that says embedding sex within marriage is not necessary. The federal government is already promoting a morality that says that parents are not responsible for monitoring their minor children's sexual activity. The government is already promoting a moral code which says that promoting contraception is the proper function of government, but that promoting marriage is not the proper function of government. The federal government has already taken over the role of the states and local communities in creating this moral code around sex and marriage. In effect, the federal government has nationalized sexual policy. In conclusion, I simply want to point out that we cannot avoid legislating morality. The attempt to remain neutral is itself not neutral. The federal government has created a moral universe based on highly debatable moral premises and empirical claims. Indeed, I think it's quite doubtful that anyone would have chosen this whole position of the sexual revolution, the whole constellation of breaking the links between marriage, spousal love, sexual activity, and child-rearing. We've slid into these things. We've slid into breaking these links, not so much that we were convinced by rational argument that each and every one of these disconnects was a good idea. We've been faced with the demands for choice or neutrality, and we've acquiesced in policies that would have really been difficult to withstand serious argument or careful scrutiny. I believe it is long past time to stop hiding behind some mythical position of neutrality, as though we could occupy some moral Switzerland where everybody is neutral. We have more than enough evidence to show and to know that the destruction of marriage has been harmful to the least well-off members of society. In the name of social justice, it is time that we mounted a full-throated defense of the ancient Christian morals. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions, and I would just ask you if you would just stand up and identify yourself and ask a succinct and not overly long question. And there are a couple of mics over here and here. So I think we have a question right here.
And by the way, did everyone who wanted to sign the clipboard get to sign it? Where is the clipboard? Who's got the clipboard?
It'll be in the back.
You got it in the back. Did everybody who want to sign it get to? Okay, great. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Annette Miranda. And first of all, I just want to affirm I see kind of where you're coming from. I work as a case manager for a shelter program, so a lot of my clients are dealing with precisely, Lucy. I have probably 10 of them.
You have 10 Lucys on your, I'm sorry, what did you say, you're a social worker?
Yeah, kind of. I don't have the formal title of a social worker, but I'm
Okay.
a case manager. So I see these kinds of things a lot. I see
Yes.
the dynamics that you're describing, but I'm also asking this question from someone who comes from a family where there was marriage and comes from a situation of poverty and also kind of sees some of these situations on a daily basis. And just thinking of Lucy's DV situation, domestic violence, all of these things, it seems as though, I want to just highlight the question that you posed. Is there any kind of feasible policy that we can put in place or any feasible rule that's outside of creating incentives for policies around marriage, wanting people to marry? I do have a handful of clients that are married, and I'm not sure that their situations don't look like Lucy's, and I'm not sure that my own situation growing up, that my families didn't look like Lucy's. I'm not sure that marriage always helps. So I'm coming from an anecdotal and kind of experiential point of view. And so in terms of that question, is there any other feasible like way around it? I mean, if you asked me what I would do with my clients, I would rather have somebody inspire them towards higher education than have somebody kind of say, hey, like, you know, that boyfriend of yours who doesn't make much income, if you get married, your income's going to increase. So I guess my question is more around, I mean, what specifically would marriage do to increase income or minimize DV? If that correlation does exist, is what I'm understanding from you. What specifically?
Yes. Okay, so let me try to deal with that, because there's two levels at which these things are taking place. Okay, I'm sure you have clients that you would not want to advise to marry. I have no doubt about that, you know, that the guys in their lives are losers, you know, and I mean, just not to put too fine a point on it, you would not want them to marry these guys, and I totally understand that. However, there are probably some where it'd be okay, right? And I think that one of the things that has happened is that no one says, you know, why don't you guys think about, you know, you're living together, you're getting along okay, why don't you get married, you know? There's very few people saying that to them. You guys, you don't have to have a big fancy wedding. It's not about queen for a day. Because a lot of people are thinking, oh, I'd love to get married someday, but what they're thinking of, they're not thinking about marriage, they're thinking about a wedding, you know, and the party and all that. So I think at the margin, there is something that you could do just as a social worker, which is to say, okay, there are some cases where it would be a good thing, and plainly some that no way you'd want the girl to marry these creeps, you know what I mean? Okay, so that's at the personal level. But now we have to take a step back and look at it from a more systemic perspective, right? Because when you're down there and you're right there looking at a very particular case, you're not seeing the big, it's harder to see the big picture of how did we get here, okay? And so one of the problems about where we are now is that we have a lot of men who are not growing up properly. And the reason they're not growing up properly is because nobody's asking them to grow up properly. There is no presumption that a man is to be the breadwinner of the household, whether he's been replaced by the state among lower income people or whether he's been replaced by a high earning wife among higher income families. There's no presumption that the man has a responsibility. And if men have responsibility, they live up to it. You know, men are capable of heroic loyalty. This is one of the things we know about men. They're capable of stepping up to the plate. We're not asking them to do so. And so one of the, I think, very, very large social problems that we have, that is getting worse, actually, is that men are not taking their proper place within the family, which means they're not taking their proper place within the society as a whole. So now what do you do about that? Well, you have to do something that allows the father to be back in the family, that it creates a presumption that father's in the family and that supports father being in the family. And part of that is that some of the welfare rules need to be modified so that you can have a spouse and not lose all your money, you know. I think that part of what has happened over the years is that in the name of social justice and in the name of individual rights or women's rights or something, I'm not sure exactly, you know, I wouldn't want to say exactly who did this or why, but we have given out money in a way that has undermined relationships within the family. Right, and so if you think about the family, and you ask, well, what's the family all about? What's parenthood all about? It's not just about big people transferring resources to little people, right? That's not what parenthood's about. Parenthood is about creating relationships. And so if you give the money, if you put income support or housing support or whatever it is, if you put that into the family in a way that disrupts the relationships, then you've done some net harm, you know. So I think that throughout our policymaking, we have to be thinking about and be mindful of the fact that whatever support we create for people, that we don't undermine the relationships, that we make it possible for people to be collaborating, that we support collaboration rather than breaking it apart. So that would be the general theme that I would give you as a way of thinking about the different kinds of policy options that might be out there. And if you think about it, there are lots of ways, you know, there are all kinds of small things that, you know, that could be done that would be constructive along those lines. So, yes, over here. Or you already have somebody in the back? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious, have we seen similar implications in other cultures that maybe seem to be more like sexually aware or have become sexually revolutionized like earlier, like thinking specifically like the Netherlands or like a more European kind of socialist culture.
Well, yes, I know something about those cultures. Wait a minute, what is it you're asking about? Okay, he wants to know. He wants to know what about some of the Western European cultures that have had the sexual revolution maybe a little sooner, a little deeper in some ways.
Yeah,
what do you want to know about them?
I was curious: is the same kind of undermining of the family, or these similar patterns of problematic cohabitation among the urban poor?
Oh my gosh. That's oh my gosh, yes. Okay, so the norm. Okay, so there are a couple things going on in Europe. First of all, the norm, particularly in Northern European countries, is that people live together. They have a baby. Maybe they have a second baby, and then decide if it will work out, and then decide if they're going to get married. So having children without being married is the norm in a lot of European countries. And that's a direct result of the welfare state, no question about it. The welfare state has, broken apart the need for there to be a family unit. The father's been completely replaced by money. So now, does that turn out to be destructive? Well, it turns out to be destructive in at least two ways that we know of for sure. First of all, there was a study done in Sweden in 2003. Now, Sweden, you'd think, is probably pretty sweet as a welfare state, pretty generous, pretty tolerant, nobody's buzzed out or whatever, if your dad's not in the house, whatever. So they did a study of single-parent households. And they compared single-parent households with coupled households. And and what they found was that in single-parent households have double or even triple the probability of suicide and mental illness among children, and alcohol and drug abuse, okay? And in that study, they held constant for income, so it's not like it's just the poor people, right? And they held constant for the mental health status of the parents. So they had a dummy variable, control variable, for whether your parents had ever had a mental illness. And still, in the most generous welfare state on earth, you're still getting these unhappy results for children. So I think that's pretty strong evidence that that there's something in the severing of relationship itself that is harmful to people, that people miss, even when they're being told they shouldn't miss it, right? So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that a lot of the European countries, the birth rate has just gone to pieces. Nobody's having babies. So even though the state is supporting them and all the financial pieces are in place, the birth rate in a lot of these countries is very low. So Germany's down, I think, to around 1.3, for example. The Scandinavian countries aren't so bad. They're up around 1.6. Replacement rate is 2.1. Right, and of all the westernized industrial countries, America and I think New Zealand are the only ones that are anywhere close to 2.1. And some of the countries are down around 1.2, 1.3. Well, what does that mean? If you have a fertility rate what this number means is that every woman has 1.2 babies over the course of her lifetime. So what that means is that she's not replacing herself and a man. You have to have 2 babies per woman, basically 2.1 babies per woman, to keep your population stable. So these are populations that are falling, that are dropping in half every generation. That's what will happen. Now, that is bizarre. If you think about it, these are the richest countries that have ever existed, and they can't sustain themselves. There's obviously something wrong with this picture. Something wrong with this picture. Yes, here's a nice person in front.
Right here, and then we have another.
Where's the microphone? Who's got the microphone? Okay. So we're biased towards the front here. After this, we'll get this person in the back here. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering if you wanted to comment in contrast, like China. And I thought it was really interesting because you said the Asian statistic of
multi-partner fertility?
Yeah, it was like the lowest, right? But at the same time, there's a huge population crisis within China, and I was just wondering.
Okay, so the question is, I don't know if you could hear the question. I'm going to restate your question. You tell me if this is what you mean to say. The statistics that I cited had Asian Americans having the lowest rate of out-of-wedlock childbearing. Okay, so those are Asians living in America, are basically getting married and having their kids within marriage. Okay, so Asians in America. And then you're wanting to know then what's going on in China as far as population is concerned in China. On the mainland China, is that what you want to know?
What I was commenting to is that your response to his question was the fact that there was such a low birth rate and that was a really bad thing.
Yes.
But there's such a high rate in China.
You think there's a high birth rate in China, do you? No, you don't think that. Do you think that?
No, it's had to be regulated, like that.
Okay, I'll just tell you a little bit about what's going on in China, and then you can tell me if this is what you wanted to know about, okay? What's going on in China, of course, has a very large population. And China, I don't know the dates of all of this, but China also was very committed to communism, which is, of course, a very unproductive economic system, right? And so they were committed to that system, and so at some point, I want to say the 70s or 80s, but don't hold me to that. They decided that the only way for them to advance economically was to have a policy of that people were only allowed to have one child, that a woman was only allowed to have one child over the course of her lifetime. And that was to address the large size of the population. So now they have the birth rate, is down to one child. I don't know exactly the number, but it's, legally, by law, you're only allowed to have one child per woman. So let me just mention a couple of problems associated with that. First of all, it's an unbelievable intrusion into individual liberty. In order to enforce that policy, they're doing things like forcing women to have abortions, that women are being tied down to gurneys and and having abortions against their will. They are required, when you're working, they'll have a poster up on the wall where women are required to post the dates of their periods. So that when your period starts, you're supposed to put it in a public place so your cadre knows that you're having a period. And if your period doesn't show up, they're going to go check on you. Okay, this is none, to me, to an American, this is like none of the government's business when my period is. I'm sorry, I'm not used to that, But that's the way they think, right? And so, families and parents are doing all kinds of things to try to deal with this. And in the rural areas, they sometimes are able to get away with having more than one child. But in the urban areas, it's really quite impossible. And they have onerous restrictions on people so that if you do somehow give birth to that second child, they start taking away housing allowances and stuff like that. You might lose your jobs. If you have 3 kids, they bulldoze your house. I mean, it's not normal for the government to try to control people's fertility. Fertility has a way of doing its own thing. And people do their own thing. So they've done this in the name of trying to control their population problem, but they're creating new problems by doing this. In addition to what I just said, China is now looking at the fact that they have they have 2 very big demographic imbalances. First is that the whole population is aging. They got a lot of old people and not very many young people to take care of them. So you got 1 child, 2 parents, 4 grandparents. So that 1 child has somehow got to work to take care of them, to pay whatever social benefits they have, which are not much, but just to do the hands-on care. For the old people. This is kind of inverted pyramid kind of thing. And the other thing that they have is a really serious gender imbalance in the population, which is because if you only get to have 1 child, in most families, enough families, they prefer that 1 child be a son. And so they have systematic infanticide or abortion of female infants, or the female infants are sent away to be adopted. That's where there are a lot of little Chinese baby girls around who are very cute and very easy to adopt, and you should all adopt one if you want, because they're good babies. You never hear anything bad about the Chinese babies. They all come in healthy and all that. But anyway, so they're great little babies, but they're exporting little girls, right? They're exporting their future like that. And so you've got a whole generation where you got a lot of guys who are never going to get married. There's no prospect of them getting married. So what that's going to do to their society is unprecedented. That's an unprecedented thing. Usually what happens when you have a gender imbalance is there's been a big war and all the men are gone, and it's the women who can't get married. Well, that happened in England after World War I. They all went and got, so what did the women do? They all went and got jobs working for detectives in detective novels. I don't know if you've seen all of them, You ever see these old movies, there's always some little spiffy girl there, who's never going to get married. Okay, so that's not so bad. She gets a job. It's lonely, it's sad, but she has a job. You got a bunch of men who have no prospect of getting married. They're not as easy to manage. They're not going to go along quietly in a detective novel, you know? So, you know, no one quite knows what's going to happen to that. But, I mean, it's really something quite unnatural that's been created by this policy, a very aggressive policy. You know, see, so the thing with demography, just want to correct one thing that you kind of said, is that the population of China is still growing because people haven't died yet, right? But the growth rate, the birth rate has fallen, so you can kind of tell when it's going to start falling. And that's the thing people often don't track when they're talking about, oh, we have a population explosion because the numbers are still growing. That's true, the numbers are still growing. But you can tell, right, when it's going to start changing, right? Because there will be no more babies born in 1960. They've all been born, you know. So you can kind of tell how many, you know, 30-year-olds there will be and 40-year-olds and all that. Okay? I don't know if that's what you wanted to know, but that's everything I know about China. Well, no, that's not true. I know more about China. But anyway, yes.
Yes. What area of study would you recommend to someone who's very interested in all of the topics you've talked about tonight? I know you mentioned economics and sociology and maybe something else, but would there be one specific or maybe two that you would recommend to someone?
Oh my goodness. That's marvelous. Wow, what a great question. Well, okay, sociology is a good one. Do you guys have a family studies program here? You probably don't have that. That's not such a common field. There are a few schools that have family studies, you know, as a distinct program, but not very many. So sociology is a good one. Psychology could be a good one as long as it's not too materialistic. And what I mean by materialistic is that there are some branches of psychology that are tracking all human behavior as if it's all biologically driven. And so you wouldn't want to get too involved in that. In other words, biology is significant, very significant. I don't want to take anything away from biology. But wait, is this a Calvinist school? Maybe I better be careful. I better be careful. I don't think biology completely drives all of human behavior. See what I mean? And so there are some branches of psychology that act like that. And so I think that wouldn't be a useful discipline. But I think some branches of psychology could be potentially very useful. And your sociology is very good. Now, as a long-run career plan, I think it would be marvelous if you would go into family law. Okay, and the reason I think you should go into family law, I mean, I don't know you, maybe you would hate it, but I mean, the reason family law would be a good field for people who care about the family to go into is that right now, family law is really a mess. It's really a mess for a number of reasons. I mean, I kind of alluded to it at the beginning of my talk, that the family law people are coming up with these ideas of, you know, gee, kids don't actually need their natural parents. It'd be okay to have the legal parent and the caregiving parent and the social parent and the biological parent be all different people. You know, that'd be okay to divide parenting responsibilities amongst 4 people. That'd really be okay. You know, they're often their dreamland. You know, that all has to do with adult desires. It's not really looking at the reality of what childhood's like. So family law has become really kind of a mess, and the reason it's become a mess is that family law is not a very lucrative area of law. And so, you know, a lot of people who are ambitious and everything, you know, they'll go into securities or corporate law or something like that. And at the academic level, that's also true. You know, people go into constitutional law. That's very exciting. You know, you change the world by changing 2 judges or something, you know. And even very constructive organizations like the Federalist Society that have done a great job in trying to bring conservative legal principles to some areas of law, they just completely overlooked family law. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but the fellows in the Federalist Society are really not interested that much in the family. And so it's just kind of coasted along, you know, being kind of filled up with people who have a kind of anti-family ideology, or who just don't know very much about it, who are kind of muddling through, you know, trying to do the best they can with the cases as they're presented to them, but they don't have a good way of conceptualizing what the family is all about. Nobody's really provided that. So family law would be a very, very important area for people to go into. Very interesting, fascinating area of law. So if you think you have a head for law, that'd be a good place to go. There's an adult question back there. That would be good. No offense, you guys, but I would like to hear what Maybe a faculty member or something.
Actually, the student questions are usually better, but I teach in the sociology social work department here.
Oh, good.
And I take issue with a lot of your comparisons in talking about Medicare and TANF policy. However, I think the important question is, I agree that there is always a morality behind public policy. The issue is, I think, the piece that's missing from your analysis is that marriage in and of itself does not create the kind of commitments, unfortunately, that you've talked about. It has to do with what are people's values, and how are people, what have had people modeled for them in a marriage relationship. And I think one of the things that you didn't bring up, that we're seeing a disillusionment with marriage among the younger generation because they have not seen it work.
Yes.
And my contention is that this is really not the role of the government. The government's policies are about access, how to have access to services for all people, irrespective of their beliefs. It seems to me that the role of enhancing marriage and enhancing the quality of marriage and the model of marriage needs to be the responsibility of the church. And where people's values are practiced and implemented, as opposed to expecting government to do this.
Okay, that's a very interesting and valid point, except that I believe the government has played a role in destroying the values around marriage. And particularly what I have in mind is that starting in 1968, one state after another initiated new rules for divorce, which was no-fault divorce. So for the first time, you could get divorced without cause. And so what that meant is that you have a contract, a long-term contract called marriage, which exists for the purpose of creating a long-term good, namely raising children to maturity, but you basically don't have much in the way of contractual protection. And at one time you did, and then after a while you don't, okay? And so we have a very high rate of divorce that the government is culpable in. I mean, I really don't think you can say that people just walked away from marriage because they didn't like it, when you realize how much in the way of government policies on a state-by-state level, case-by-case level, had been changing. And it wasn't changing because people demanded that it change. It changed from the legal bar changing it. And so what that does is that it changes the terms under which everybody gets married. So even if you have very strong marriage values, maybe all the kids in this room have a very strong marriage value, but if you go and get married, in point of fact, permanent marriage is not available to you, because your partner can at any time walk for any reason or no reason. And I think that's a significant change since, since most of American life, and something that the church should play a role in doing something about, but the church can't do it all in the face of those kinds of incentives. So it looks like you have a response. Go ahead. No? I thought you had the microphone in front of you. Oh, okay. Well, never mind then. Maybe we'll talk at dinner. I don't know. Okay.
I think we have time for maybe two more questions. You can pick.
There's the young man in the yellow shirt there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Barnabas.
Hi, Barnabas.
You made the point that social welfare for single mothers undermines the institution of marriage. Is that correct?
I didn't exactly say that, no, but where are you going with this?
Well, I mean, as a policy question, that suggests that, having that social safety net for mothers provides or for single mothers provides a moral hazard against the family unit, and it's just validity and its coherence, like its ability to take care of the individuals is no longer as necessary because you have the social safety net there in place for the single mothers.
Okay, yes, that's true.
Policy-wise, do you think it's it's a good idea for us to drop that social welfare safety net for
I think you
mothers.
can change it at the margins in ways that would be constructive. So, for example, you could, I think it's probably constructive. I think the new rules are that you can't be on it for a long period of time. You can make it so that it's not your sole source of support, and it isn't meant to be your sole source of support. You can make it so that if you get married, you don't lose it all. You know, that if you have a husband in the household, that's not the end of it. You know, so there are a number of changes that one can make at the margin that would be constructive. And honestly, I think it would be constructive if states could do some fooling around themselves, because then you could figure it out. Then you could look and see some experimentation. One of the big disadvantages of federal rules, of national rules, I should say, is it undermines the federal system. You know, where different states have tried different things. And I think this is actually the exact place. Yeah, this area and divorce policy both are exactly places where you should let states make their own rules and see what happens, you know, so you can have some experience with it and see what's going to be more constructive and stuff. But I think there are a number of margins where you could do that.
A lot of the reforms you mentioned are reforms that have been recently.
What's that?
A lot of the reforms you just suggested are some that have been recently.
Yeah, well, that's, yeah, that might be a good thing, you know. But having said all that, then the point that was raised before is extremely important, that now it's important to build up the culture of marriage and the values of the marriage, and so that the church needs to not give up, right, and just kind of throw up its hands and say, oh, well, you know, whatever, you know, because I know as a pastoral problem, it can be kind of complicated, because you, on the one hand, you don't want to say it's okay, you want to say, well, we want you to live the way God wants you to live, but on the other hand, you want to support people, and it really is the church that is in a position to make that kind of more complicated message, rather than a lady who fills out forms and gives out checks, right? Because in the church, you can say, you know, look, we're going to help you. We're not going to leave you on the street. But at the same time, we're going to make it clear that there's a better way than what you're doing. This is not what God wants you to do. This is not what we want you to do. We're going to help you. We're going to show you the better way. We're going to model you the better way, and so on and so forth. So the church has a very significant role to play, but they have to be working in tandem. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that the government has taken over an enormous amount of this area and made it very hard. It's kind of marginalized the church and the church's message. One last question here in the front.
My name is Stephanie. I'm kind of going back to what the professor said.
You need to talk into the mic.
I'm kind of going back to what the professor said and what Annette brought up about, I feel like you're making the assumption that the values of marriage that like so many people maybe in a Christian context have are going to like are innate in marriage or are going to just follow the act of marriage. And I'm just kind of wondering if you could speak to why you think that making policies like that promote and give people incentives to get married would make people respect that more, because wouldn't people just get married to get the benefits of marriage, and wouldn't like doing something such as, you know, launching a social norms campaign around like males being more responsible fathers be more beneficial to society and for single mothers than kind of hoping that the values of marriage just kind of
okay, so I hear you saying two things. One is you're saying, I think you're saying, well, at the very end, I think you're saying, well, shouldn't we just promote fathers being good fathers, whether they're married or not?
Or just family values, and then the norms of society will change. And just because it's like promoting marriage itself, like through a policy, is not going to change the norms of society.
But see, the point is your norms around marriage really are the norms of society in a way. I think that's kind of the point. And so I think there was one question that was implicit, I think I didn't deal with, is the question, is it marriage that's changing you, or is it just the kind of person who gets married?
That's what I'm asking you.
Is that what you're, okay, yeah, I think the other person was kind of asking that too. So here's the question. We got all these results about how marriage looks good. Is that because the kind of person who gets married is systematically a better person in some way, a person who is already more committed, a person who is already more willing to make sacrifices, and so on and so forth? The fact that the person has chosen to get married, is that a strong enough indicator that that's what's doing the job rather than marriage itself? And I think the answer to that question, insofar as we know the answer to that question, is yes and yes. You know, in other words, both of those things are a factor. It's true that the kind of person who gets married is systematically better marriage material than the people who don't, right? Okay, and so if you look at the data, it's like you have this big selection effect where all the smart people get married. So that means if you're saying, well, I don't have to get married because that's only a selection effect, you're basically saying, I'm an idiot and I'm a loser, so because I'm selecting myself into the non-marriage group. But anyway, that's just what you're saying. I often have male law students talk to me like this. I have to make them be quiet. But anyway, so that's what it is. There is a selection effect. But it's also true that marriage itself does something to you. And it does a lot of things to you. And one place you can see that is you can see it, one thing that's been studied quite a bit is men's earnings. That men actually do behave differently when they get married. It's not just that the good guys get married and the knuckleheads don't, that there's some of that, but guys behave differently once they get married. And if you watch men that you know who get married, you'll feel it in yourself too when you get married. You'll feel yourself starting to be reoriented toward the good of another person instead of just toward yourself, you know. So you make yourself marriage material. Take as given everything you say, yes, there's a selection effect. But it's also true that you can make yourself into marriage material. And it is, I think, constructive for us as adults to say that to you guys, you know, so that you realize that there are things you can do that are intrinsically constructive. Right? And so that's the one part of what you asked about. And the other part is, I think what you're saying is, shouldn't we just have good family values in the first place? Why do we particularly need marriage? Well, I think, to me, marriage is an issue of justice to children. Marriage and spousal cooperation is an issue of justice to children. That is, that every person comes into this world helpless and dependent and is brought into the world by two people. And each of us has a right to know our parents, to be known by our parents, to receive love and care from our parents. We know that doesn't always happen. Of course we know that. We're not stupid. We know that doesn't always happen. But I think you have to say, I think we have to say as a society that this is what we ask of ourselves. This is what we ask of ourselves. This is what is worthy of us. You know, for me to have a child and think that that's unimportant, we can't be saying that to ourselves. We can't let ourselves off the hook so easily. It's not like I'm saying, you single mothers over there, you have to shape up. No, this is something really and truly, the culture of responsible parental cooperation, that applies to everybody, no matter what your income class is. It's something everybody can benefit from, and something everybody can contribute to. And we're not asking that of ourselves. And I think we have a responsibility to start talking about that in a realistic way, knowing perfectly well that there are going to be problems. You know, even in a happy marriage, you're going to have problems. Knowing perfectly well there are going to be problems. But if you don't have a goal, you'll never get there. So we'll leave it there.
Well, thank you all for coming. Just before you leave, and this is actually a good note to end on, because tomorrow in convocation, her address is going to be "Marriage is a Social Justice Issue." And if you're interested in learning more about the Ruth Institute, there's material here. And I believe we have a book table in the back as you go out. So thanks for coming. Hope to see some of you tomorrow morning.